Welcome to episode 0 of Arthur Brewer's amazing podcast. Arthur, what is the name of this podcast?
This is the Melodology Podcast.
And you are an accomplished composer, so you write pieces of music, and you love music.
Yes,
I pretty much have that right?
Absolutely.
And one of the things I love about you, like me, is you love film scores. By the way, I'm Steven Shomler. I love podcasts. I love Arthur. I'm excited about this podcast. So we're going to explain in just a second what the podcast is, but who's it primarily for?
This is designed for people who write music or write songs. Composers and songwriters are going to be the primary audience.
But you're going to make it somewhat accessible for musical idiots like me. So, for example, I'm not clear what it's. This is a podcast about melodies, right?
Yes.
So what is a melody?
A melody, just, for non-musical people, a melody is one of the building blocks of a song. So a lot of people know Mary Had a Little Lamb. The melody for Mary Had a Little Lamb is just this part. Da 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 da. That's the first part of just the melody.
Okay, so for musical ignorant people like me, melody is a building block of a song. You just gave me one. When I do the craft beer podcast on my podcast, I can tell a really simple definition of how to make beer. But oh boy, the experts, they know 10 more million things than I say. And so musical people could probably give a lot more expanded definition than you just did for melody. Am I right?
Correct.
But we got to make at least every episode I encourage you to say, just give that little Mary Had a Limb definition's great, and it'll bring the regular people like me along. And I don't think if you take 15 seconds to do that, you won't drive the musical geniuses too much crazy. Although I think people that do music already are a little crazy, aren't they?
We can be crazy, yeah.
So tell me about, so you've recorded 4 or 5 episodes already. So this will be episode 0, explaining it to people. Have the guests, but do composers, musicians, do they love melodies? Do they not? How's the response been?
The response has been fantastic. In fact, I was really surprised when I came up with the idea. I was thinking that I was just going to talk about the melodies myself and that I would be looking at the melodies and examining them. But I thought I'm not necessarily the world's greatest expert on melodies. And what if I had somebody else on the show to talk about these melodies with me, to talk about what they're seeing and the way these things were created? Because every piece of music you've ever heard, somebody created that piece of music. At some point it didn't exist, and then somebody wrote it, and then it existed and was heard for the very first time, and there was craft put into the process of making that piece of music.
And what fascinates me about melodies is, and I don't know enough about music to understand it, but when you listen to an entire song, there's bunches of little bits all stuck together that even though when they're different, they kind of flow together. And it's pretty amazing how it's almost like in my head, I know cooking, one of my podcasts is a Culinary Treasure podcast, and you put all the ingredients together. And if you're not careful, instead of soup, you just have flavored hot water. But if you do it right, it goes from flavored hot water to something like magical, like soup, whether it's a thin broth or a thick broth. It becomes different. And I think am I right? It kind of the same way it all kind of flows together, even when it's dissonant notes together sometimes?
It does. It all flows together. Sometimes there's spice. So like a dissonant sound can be spicy. There's also the little elements you mentioned. Those things are like the little ingredients. So all sorts of different recipes can have pepper in them, but all sorts of songs can have these same little components in them that are building blocks of a song, but put them together in different ways and they sound completely different.
Now I'm actually kind of excited about hearing the podcast because just the way I like to hear a chef say, you add this little thing and it makes all the difference, and they know enough where these little bits of ingredients or when you add them or where you add them, how it takes it from flavored hot water to soup. And I love a really good soup, and I can't stand when they don't nail it. To hear experts talk about it, I may not understand everything you guys will talk about, but I bet I'm going to find it intriguing and enlightening about the whole process of creating music.
Well, I hope so, because we are trying to make sure we include references or definitions for things. If we're just using some term that's a musical term that composers or musicians know, but it's not something that just somebody who doesn't know and hasn't studied music, if they're not going to know what that word is, we usually stop and define it so that people are clear and we're not just using words that people have to then go look up in a dictionary.
Yeah, but I won't mind when someone goes off on a passionate, detailed rant I have chefs on my podcast and they start talking about some process I don't even understand, but I love their passion and I kind of get the gist of what they're saying, even if they're using terms I've never heard before. On my podcast, I've developed a silly thing that kind of emerged. I ask everybody, regardless of the podcast, the same questions. Where were you born? Where did you go to high school? What was your high school mascot? And I've learned that the poor people that went to high school in Europe, they don't have high school mascots there. They're bereft of that. It's kind of a silly, fun thing, but it kind of gives me a sense of who they are. It gives me a little bit of sense of their geographic. If they live in Bozeman now, but they started out in Boston and they have a strong Boston accent. There's a brewer in Bozeman, Montana that did that. And it's like, okay, but the culture in Boston, he had to learn to mellow out a little bit. And so just 3 silly questions that emerged for me. You've done a number of them. Have any questions emerged for you that you're asking every guest toward the beginning?
Yeah, I wanted to ask about their experience with both music and with melodies. So I will usually ask first off, what's the earliest that you can remember being affected by music or by a particular melody?
Interesting. Yeah, that's brilliant. I sometimes ask people, but later, not at the beginning, if they make chocolate or if they make rum, what's your earliest chocolate memory or your earliest rum memory? And there's usually a fun story there. That's brilliant. And then do you have another question you ask them?
Yeah, I also ask when it was that they realized the power of music. What moment in their life can they remember where they really thought, wow, isn't it amazing what music can do?
Like for me, it would be, when did music move me emotionally?
Right.
I think it was either, for me, I think what really hit me for music was, Star Wars. Sitting in the theater, Tyler Mall, Riverside, California, watching Star Wars, and that music was just intense, and I didn't even understand. I think it was you who told me this bit of brilliance that, because I'm musical, I just didn't get it. I'm not musical. I'm not necessarily as buffy as a film buff as I thought. But every time Princess Leia appears, they play a Princess Leia piece.
And it's not even necessarily every time she appears, but if somebody's thinking about her music appears, and then the audience knows that somebody's thinking about Princess Leia.
And I didn't know that until you told me recently, which kind of blew my mind. But I was a little kid in the theater watching Star Wars, and even though music wasn't a big part of my journey, just that, the music, it was as much a part of that movie as of the experience of it as anything else.
Yeah, in that case, it's a huge part of the film. It's one of the reasons that the film was as successful as it was, and it's some of the most fantastic music in film, and it's really brilliant melody making. So Princess Leia's theme, it's a melody. The Star Wars theme, that's a melody. And then when you get to Empire Strikes Back, you have Darth Vader's theme, you have the Imperial March. That's a melody. And all of those things are just fascinating, the way that they are created, and looking at them and realizing the brilliance of the people who created those. And in that case, that's all John Williams.
Yeah, if you, to me, want to convey evil musically to my ears, you'll play the Imperial March or that awful noise from Jaws.
Yes, the da-dun. Just that.
Yeah, is that a melody?
That is a motif. That's a building block of a melody. It's just 2 notes or 3 notes or 4 notes can be a motif. It's a pattern. And then you can repeat the pattern in different ways, and different, higher or lower or faster or slower. And in the case of Jaws, it's just this little half-step sound. Ba-dum. And you can do it once. And as soon as you do it once in that movie, it's going to start getting bad. But once it starts going, ba-dum, 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 ba, get out of the water.
Oh, yeah, already I'm getting nervous. and so look at you putting music into plain English. And so I'll tell someone today, by the way, I love melodies, but I like how there's a specific motif inside every melody. They'll go, what the heck are you talking about? Like, I don't really know, but it's true. What I told you is true, even if I don't understand it.
Excellent.
And do you have a third question you're going to ask your guests at the beginning?
Yes, I actually asked them, are you a fan of film scores? Because
this is fantastic.
That's a question that people think, most composers tend to be film score fans, or sometimes they also don't like film scores because they feel that film scores are too basic and they kind of manipulate people by using just really simple pieces of music, which I'm all for that. I saw Star Wars in the theater and I thought, I want to do that. I want to make people feel excited. I want to make people cry. It's fun being able to be happy making people cry and not having it be something psychotic. But it's a thing that is a power of music to give somebody emotion without them necessarily even know how it's happening.
So I didn't know it at the time, but Star Wars impacted me in that it furthered my love of storytelling. For you, it inspired you toward music and composing. Is that right?
Correct. I wanted to do film scores. I wanted to create music that moved people the same way that it moved me. And the idea that I could listen to that whole soundtrack, because I got a vinyl record of Star Wars almost immediately after the film came out, and I saw it in the theater. I had the vinyl record and I played that constantly. I'm sure my parents were just sick of it, but I played that record over and over, and I could experience those scenes in my head and get that same excitement from the moments in the film when the music happens without even looking at it. I could relive the movie by just listening to the music.
Okay, so the 3 questions you're going to ask all your guests, you'll have an introduction, so you'll get to know who the guest is and a little bit about them, and then you're going to ask them about an early memory of melodies or music. Mm-hmm. You're going to ask them when they realized that music could move people emotionally. Those are my words. I'm kind of paraphrasing, right? Mm-hmm. And then you're going to ask them about film scores, where they're at with them, if they love them, they hate them, if they like them, do they have a favorite?
Right, and so far in the episodes we've recorded, people have had specific films that were the early films they remembered. And composers, in some cases, because we are composers, we know the names of the people who wrote those film scores. And so they'll talk about their favorite film score composers. And it's been interesting because people have very different, first of all, different ages. I've had a wide range of ages of composers, and I plan to just have every possible composer I can have on this show. But having somebody who's 23 on the show and having somebody who's 53, me, on the show, we have different films that we saw when we were kids. And that can be a really interesting thing too, because you'll have completely different composers in some cases. Of course, John Williams is still composing. So people who've grown up now have also experienced John Williams. But a lot of composers have come along since him as well. And so there's all sorts of different kinds of music in films, and people have different memories of the films that moved them.
John Williams, what are some of the movies he's done?
John Williams did Star Wars, it really brought back big orchestral movie scores in 1977 when that film came out. He also composed Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Jaws, Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T. He has done so many of the well-known film scores that people know the melodies of. He's really responsible for, and another big one, Superman from 1981. That that Superman theme was John Williams.
So another composer that I know, and I can't say his name, but Michael, he did the Star Trek film score.
Michael Giacchino.
Michael Giacchino, he's done like stuff for all kinds of things people don't even realize.
He has worked on a number of different films. He did Ratatouille and The Incredibles. He's got a really wide range of film scores as well.
Yeah, the one I liked where I bought the album was Speed Racer. He did Up. Talk about a brutal song and a wonderful song. I'm excited for this podcast. I'm excited to check it out. Now, a lot of composers don't know this fact, and we need to educate them. But in the whole history of the world, do you know the time period that's the greatest ever for the history of civilization for music?
I'm not sure where you're going with this. What time period is that?
It would be the 80s. It would be the 80s. The 80s are absolutely magnificent music. And a lot of composers right now say, that's it, this guy's an idiot.
Well, you actually have quite a point, because there was a huge growth of popular music in the 80s. We had the occasion of MTV coming out. So now music that would normally just be on the radio was also on television. And you had videos that now went with those songs. And so there is a lot of really great music that came out of the 80s and a lot of really good melodies. And I am sure that at some point we will be talking about the melodies of songs from the 80s, because there are just so many great tunes from the 80s. Just to list one, Madonna is an amazing songwriter, and her melodies, you start singing a Madonna song and you remember the melody and you hear it and you're brought back to whatever year or whatever decade it was that's from. And she's been writing since the 80s and is still creating music.
Okay, so again, melody is just part of a song. So does the composer, your guest, do they pick the song that you're going to then talk about the part of?
Yes, I'm asking them if they have a particular melody that they really would like to talk about. And so far, about half of the people I've invited on have just grabbed a melody and said, oh, I want to talk about this one. And the others have been, oh, there's so many melodies I could talk about. What if I did this one or this one or this one? And then we kind of negotiate down to what would be something that would be really a good thing to start with on the podcast, because it's just starting. I'm just beginning to do this. I want to make sure I work out the kinks on it and get it so that it's smooth and understandable and the process is good and that everybody has fun along the way.
So I bet you're going to have, over time, popular culture songs, old songs, old composer songs from people long dead that I can't even think of. But I know the pieces even though I don't know them. I bet you can have blues songs. Jazz, isn't jazz like sometimes not even follow rules? Is there melody to jazz songs?
There is absolutely melody to jazz songs. In fact, with jazz, you get handed a great big thick book of a whole bunch of jazz tunes, and all you see when you look at the notes on the page is just the notes that make up the melody. And then you get instructions for what chord you play, what set of notes you play along with that melodic part. So you get this thing called a fake book, and the fake book has all these songs in it, but you only see the melody and the chords. The only notes on the page, the little black dots. It's just the melody part.
So I'm excited. I think you're going to have a whole bunch of different genres and different pieces and different songs. And for me, I could imagine, great, I love the melody, but I want to talk about every piece of the song. And I bet some people want to just get into a whole song.
Right. And I originally thought of the idea of just focusing on the most familiar part of a melody. So for example, the song When You Wish Upon a Star, it actually has a whole bunch of notes that come along. There's a verse, so a whole bunch of words and notes that come along before the famous part. And the famous part is da 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 da. That's the part that everybody knows. That's the melody that everybody knows. So we're going to focus just on that part of that song. And there are other songs where the entire piece of music is just going to be so fascinating to look at that we'll do a deep dive. So one of the 4 podcasts that I've recorded so far is a deep dive into a whole song. And the other ones, well, actually, no, 2. One's also a hymn. So we have a deep dive basically into a whole piece of music. And then in the other 2, we just chose part of a melody or part of the song so that we could focus on the part of the song that people recognize and the part that's familiar versus the entire thing.
Okay. I think this is going to be exciting. I think you're going to have a lot of cool music. And then you can bring the best of 2 worlds together. This is my final suggestion for you. Every once in a while, you have a composer where you do the soundtrack to an 80s film.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. What any come to mind that you like? Film scores from songs in the 80s? Because like Star Wars is 70s. We're old.
Star Wars is 70s. Superman, the first Superman was 81. Pretty sure that the Terminator movies 1 and 2, I think they're both 1 and 2 are from the 80s, although 2 might have been in the 90s. Oh, there's a bunch, but I don't want to grab which dates they are because I can get them wrong from the 90s and the 70s.
Rocky IV was from the 80s, and it's brought back some music from the 70s. But one of the best all time for music. Oh, it's just phenomenal. And set the scene for the movie. This is probably not a composer's favorite movie or songs, but I love it. Karate Kid.
Oh, there you go.
I mean, you've got the moment of truth where he's at the end. It's incredible. You've got You're the Best by Joe Esposito. You've got Bop Bop on the Beach, Jan and Dean, and they weave that in there. There's just so many good songs. Oh, it just made my heart ache. I saw it in the theater and I was so sad and so happy.
So isn't it Karate Kid 2 that has the song I Am a Man Who Will Fight for Your Honor? Isn't that
I think so. I don't know, but I think so. Anyways, I think this is going to be a phenomenal podcast. I'm super excited. I think the composers get to come on are going to be lucky and have a good time. And I think the musical people are going to be fired up to hear it. And I love that you're going to put it in plain English for musical idiots like me.
Thank you very much. Well, And I'm also giving my guest composers the chance to talk about stuff that they're working on, either stuff that they're proud of that they've already done, but also to tell us what they are planning on doing and what's coming up for them. And that's exciting as well.
Now, podcasts, you listen to them. And so that's the primary thing. You go to podcast channel, wherever you find your podcast, you listen to it. But my podcasts all have websites. So culinarystreasurenetwork.com, and people can go to that website. And then I've got the About, where you can follow my podcast on Instagram and Facebook, so they know when a new episode comes out. And then each individual podcast gets its own article where I embed the podcast right there, so that grandma or grandpa who's a fan of my guest that's never going to figure out how to do Apple Podcasts, they can hit the play button. And then below I have links to follow my guests. You can follow my guest, their restaurant, if they're a chef or their distillery or their chocolate place. And I make it easy for people in that one. Just go right to the website, and then you can see all of the podcasts. And podcast people, they go to to Spotify or to iHeartRadio or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or Amazon Podcasts or Samsung Podcasts, wherever they go. But normal people, it's a website. Are you going to have a Melody Podcast website?
The website itself is melodologypodcast.com.
.com?
Yep,
Awesome.
melodologypodcast.com. But on social media, I was able to get Melody Podcast. So it's easy to remember, easier to spell. Melody Podcast, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, but also on SoundCloud and on Patreon. So you mentioned it being a podcast that people can listen to. We're also going to be recording a video episode for every single podcast, and we'll be looking at the notes on the screen as well. So people who would like to watch the video, if you become a patron on Patreon, you can see the videos as we are talking about the different notes and talking about the melody. So you get the added benefit of not just hearing the notes and how they relate to each other, but you can see them on the screen as well.
If I'm excited and I want to be a patron and I want to be involved in Patreon and see these podcasts, what's the website that people go to find out all about your podcast? All the information.
All the information is at melodologypodcast.com.
Including probably right at the top, it says be a patron or Patreon.
Right at the top, there's a link for Patreon, and there's links to our social media as well.
Fantastic. Good. And then I'll be able to listen to the podcast on the website as well if I'm a troglodyte?
Yep. You have been a great coach in putting together podcasts and making sure that I have everything easy for people to use. Every single episode will have a page describing what's in the episode and talking about it, also with times for the different sections, because we'll do the introduction and then we'll be looking at the melody and then we'll be talking about the composer. So I'll point about those times. If somebody just wants to get right to the melody, I'll say where that is, but that's all going to be on the description. And then you'll have a little embedded player where you can just click play and you can listen to it right on the website.
Wow. Now the sections of a podcast, I'm not going to do that much work for people, like just go listen to things. But my son, Zach, for Strong Opinion Sports, he puts down in his longer episodes, the timestamps for different topics. And for you to do that same thing, man, you're even doing better for your fans than I do for mine. So hats off to you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we've come to the end of episode 0. I'm super excited about the Melodology Podcast, www.melodologypodcast.com. Did I have that right?
You have that right. Although we're not quite to the end, because another part that I'm going to be doing every single time is saying to my guest, how can people find you?
Well, if you just, the easiest way is you can go to stevenshomler.com, and then I have links from there to all my other websites and all the things I do.
And it's Steven spelled the right way, with a V.
Steven with an N and a V. I don't like that guy, Steve. There's a story there we won't tell publicly ever. But Steven with an S-T-E-V-E-N, and then S-H, no C. People put a C in sometimes. I don't know why. S-H-O-M as in Mary, L-E-R, stevenshomler.com. And you can go to stevenshomler.com or just Google me. I've had help from an SEO master. I think his name's Arthur Breur. He's not only an incredible composer, but he's a genius with computer stuff. So if you Google me, you find all my things. But if you go to stevenshomler.com, I have links to stuff professionally. I'm blessed by choice and design. I have 2 professional pursuits and 2 professional titles. I help people with life change, and I'm a life story alchemist. Sparked a Bonfire is my business there. And then I'm a culinary storyteller, and I'm kind of like a Swiss Army knife of food and travel content creation, and I have the Culinary Treasure Network, and there's articles. We have we have websites with articles you can read, podcasts you can listen to, shows you can watch. I have writers writing for me, food and travel writers writing for me in addition to me. So it's a lot of fun. I either get to do life change stuff or food and travel, and both of them make me very happy.
That's excellent.
So that's what I do. And I do have 2 podcasts, and with more coming. I have a food podcast, but then I've got a couple storytelling podcasts working in the background.
And so what are those?
I'll be doing the Spark to Bonfire podcast, help people with life-changing books that I found that help people really well. And then the Epic Discourse podcast, because some people, if I want to tell the Arthur Breur story, I can't put you in the beer podcast. I can't put you in the food podcast, but I want to tell your story. And I love you and I love your story. So I come up with the Epic Discourse podcast. So those will come later this year.
Excellent. Thank you.
That's what I do in a nutshell. But yeah, just Google me, Steven Shomler. I'm on all the things.
Awesome. So thank you, everybody, for listening to episode 0 of the Melodology Podcast. Oh, and we forgot one thing. The one thing we forgot is the tagline. The tagline that you helped me come up with for the Melodology Podcast. So the tagline is celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers.
I love that. That's fantastic. And there's a lot of unsung excellence in melodies because idiots like me don't even know that the melody is amazing. We don't even know what a melody is, let alone it's amazing. And to be able to unpack that with people passionate about it, I think for people that love music, this is going to be phenomenal.
It's going to be a fun adventure.